and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you're a returning viewer. I'm Maisie, and it's Maisie with a Z, and today, for the last day of Bookmas, I decided to talk about my top 20 fantasy reads of the year. So I'm not going to be talking about these in any particular order, but I am going to be splitting them up by genre. So, I'm going to be talking about the epic fantasy books together, I'm going to be talking about the historical fantasy books together, I'm going to be talking about the YA books together, etc. To get into it, I'll start with the 5 epic fantasy books on this list, where the first one I'll be talking about is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. This is inspired by Middle Eastern folklore and 1001 Nights, and it follows the main character Lily, who's known as the Midnight Merchant, and she and her bodyguard, who's a djinn, basically sell illegal magic on the black market. She's blackmailed by the Sultan to track down a magical artifact. She's accompanied by one of the Sultan's sons, who's one of our other POV characters. It's just this really fun fantasy world. It's beautifully written. I love all the characters. I love the magic system, and Chelsea Abdullah just does a really good job with this. And the second book is coming out in early 2024, and I'm super excited. But yeah, this was a really good debut book, but it is amazing and I highly recommend it, and I don't see enough people talking about this book. And then next up is a book everyone talks about, which is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first Mistborn book. It's the first Cosmere book I ever picked up. I absolutely loved it. It's basically set in this world where it's like 1,000 years ago the Chosen One failed, and now everyone's kind of living with the consequences. I don't want to explain too much of the plot because I don't want to give anything away, but the magic system is super interesting. It's unique and it's complex without being hard to understand. This follows a group who are trying to pull off a heist that will take down their dictator of this world. It's so good. I don't know, it's so fun, it's so surprising, and everything about it is so good. I don't have anything new to say about Mistborn, but it is so good. Next up, we have Empire of Storms, and also a bonus of Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas, where I finished the Throne of Glass series this year, where only the last 3 books were new to me. The rest I'd all read before, so I'm not including them on this list. But Empire of Storms and Kingdom of Ash, which I'm including together as the same listing, but I love this series so much. It is it's such good fantasy. I love all the characters so much. This is honestly the first book I can remember that ever made me actually start crying. Not just tear up, but I was actually crying when I was reading it. Kingdom of Ash, not Empire of Storms. But it's so good. Even if you've tried Of Court of Thorns and Roses and not loved it, I would still recommend trying this. It's much more fantasy focused than ACOTAR is. Where ACOTAR is very much Romantasy, but Throne of Glass is much closer is much more of a typical fantasy storyline. That's all I have to say about it. I can't say too much because these books are the 6th and 8th books in a series, so there's nothing I can say without spoiling. And then next up is Priory of the Orange Tree, which is standalone sapphic fantasy with dragons, and it's so good. I love the world building so much. I love the dragons so much. I love all the characters. Except for one character who's kind of the worst, but he's not that important. I love all the other characters, and it's so good. Even if you feel intimidated by the length, it doesn't feel that long once you're actually into it. It's just a good time, and it keeps you going, and it's good. And then next up is our only real romantasy book on this list, where I'm counting Throne of Glass more in the realm of epic fantasy than romantasy. But we have Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, and there's a reason this book has been everywhere this year, which is it is just so fun, and it's addictive, and the characters are compelling, and it is such a good time. Is it the most well-written fantasy world I've ever read? No. But it's really fun, and it brought me joy in a time I needed joy, and I really appreciate it for that. And also I have to appreciate it just for having disabled characters in fantasy. Violet, our main character, has a connective tissue disorder, and there's a deaf character, and knowing sign language is normalized, and yeah, it's a good time. Iron Flame was slightly less of a good time, but Fourth Wing is a really good, it's fun. Don't go into it if you're gonna take it too seriously, but it's such a good time, and I gave it 5 stars for that. And then next up, we have our 4 historical fantasy books. The first of those is Babel by R.F. Kuang. I don't know how it took me so long to read this, but it's set in the mid-19th century, and it's following a boy named Robin who's adopted from China by an Oxford professor, and he's kind of raised to go to this translation college at Oxford. The magic system's kind of complicated, but it's basically dealing with this idea of utilizing the concepts that are lost in translation. So like translating a word in one language to a word in another language, and then the magic is kind of dealing with what is lost when you do that translation. But it's very much dealing with the idea of academia and academia knowledge as a tool for colonization. And it's really well done. It's about language and power and revolution, and it's really well done. It's a really good read. It's really well written, and like if you have any interest in fantasy, historical fiction, language, generally knowledge as a concept, this is a really worthwhile read. Like R.F. Kuang is extremely smart. She put a lot of thought and research into this, and it really shines through. And then we've got The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This is basically set around the suffragist movement, and it's set in like New Salem, which was built to replace Old Salem, which was like completely burned to the ground to get rid of witches. And it's following these three sisters who've been estranged, but they're like kind of brought together magically at a suffragist meeting, and they start working with this movement, and meanwhile they're also like rediscovering magic that's kind of been lost and kind of been like taken away from women. It's this really lovely story about sisterhood and empowerment, and about power being taken away and like tamped down by those in control. And I think it does a really good job that I wasn't necessarily expecting of also touching on other important social movements at the time, where it touches on labor movements, it touches on the way like Black women were excluded from the suffragist movement, and I think it ties together all the threads really nicely, and it's really beautifully written, and it's like, I could not put this book down. Like, if you even remotely like witch stories, then this is absolutely a really amazing book for you. Like, it's so good. I love our three main characters. I love all the romances, and it's just, it's good. And then next up is The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Shana Chakraborty, and this is one of my favorite books of the year. I love my pirate fantasy. This is following pirates in the Indian Ocean, and it's following our main character, Amina al-Sirafi, who was a super well-known pirate and then retired to take care of her daughter. She's offered a job by the mother of a former member of her crew to go find that member's daughter. It's kind of this fun getting the gang back together thing where she's gathering up all the old members of her crew and they're going on this adventure, and it's so fun. I love all the characters. It's such a good like pirate read. If you like pirates, you should read this. It's just good. And I'm super excited for the rest of the series. Last up under historical fantasy is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and this has been all over my channel recently, where I feel like I bring it up in every single video. But it's by Heather Fawcett, and it's following a Cambridge professor who studies fairies, and she goes with another Cambridge professor to a small town in Scandinavia to study the fairies there. And I was like debating whether to put this in cozy fantasy or historical fantasy, but I ended up putting it in historical fantasy. I don't know why, but I did. We're gonna do cozy fantasy next. It's gonna be fine. We can call this a bridge. But it's just so good. I love the fairy plot, and it's about the fantasy, but it's also about Emily learning to like let people care about her. And the next book is coming out in a couple weeks, and I'm so excited. And then next up is our cozy fantasy category, which we're starting off with Half a Soul, which is another one where I was debating whether to put it in historical fantasy or cozy fantasy. But this one was definitely on the cozy side of that divide. Where this is part of the Regency fairy tale series, so it's set in Regency England, and Half a Soul is the first book in the series where they're all a little connected, but like you don't have to read one to read the others. This is following our main character Dora, who has half her soul stolen by a fairy as a child, which kind of takes away her ability to like feel most emotions. And so when she goes to London for the season to accompany her cousin who's making her debut there, they're seeking out the Lord Sorcier, who's like the head magician of the society, in order to try and find a way to get back the other half of her soul, where it's cozy and whimsical and romantic, but it's also touching on issues like the conditions of the working class during the time period, and doing so in a much more complex way than like most Regency romance books will try to do, and I really appreciated it for that. and it's just so fun, and I love the romance, I love all of it. Like, it's just so good. The fairy and magic aspects are so fun, and it's just a good time. And speaking of good times, the next up is The League of Gentlewomen Witches by India Holton, and this is the second book in her Dangerous Damsel series. The series is just so fun. It's about pirates and witches just running around like Victorian era England. It's so fun and absurd, and all the main characters are absolutely insane, and I love them. It's just a good time, and I did really enjoy. I also read the first book in the series, which is The Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels, this year, but The League of Gentlewomen Witches just absolutely stole my heart, where there's so many Pride and Prejudice references, and it's enemies to lovers, and I love our main character, and it's just so fun. Like, that's what the series is it's fun. It doesn't take itself seriously, and neither should you. And this book follows a witch and a pirate who are like kind of reluctant allies as they seek out this artifact that's been stolen, but it's absolutely off the rails. It's so fun. That's the only word for it, is it's a fun time. Next up is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, which is basically synonymous with cozy fantasy at this point. It's been everywhere. And this is following a orc who, it's kind of set in like a D&D inspired world, but the orc has been basically part of an adventuring party for a long time, and she retires to start a coffee shop because she wants to kind of like change of lifestyle. And it's just so cozy. It's about her setting up this coffee shop and making connections and community. And it's just like super lovely and low stakes. It's so comforting, and this is like the epitome of cozy fantasy. It's just like comforting to read. Like, nothing that bad happens. It's just like she's setting up the coffee shop, and there's a sapphic romance, and all of the characters are so fun, and like, it's a good time, where if you're looking for something low stakes like that, this is such a good choice for you. And then we've got Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. This is following this man whose like entire life has been business and work, and then he dies at work one day, and he's brought to a tea house that's kind of where like souls go until they're ready to pass on. And it's kind of following him learning to like actually make connections with others for the first time ever, like once he's already died. It's so sweet. It's about human connection and what's actually important in life, and this is another just like slow-paced, comforting read, which like TJ Klune is very good at. Next up is a book kind of in its own category, because I didn't really know what category to put it in, but that's Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a retelling of the character of Circe from Greek mythology. It's a really lovely like slow-paced read. Like, it's slow-paced and very much about like the plight of women in Greek mythology, and it's lovely and well thought out, and it's such a good read. If you like Greek mythology, you should read this. If you don't like Greek mythology, I don't know if you'd like this. But it's such a good time, or it's not a good time because like it's heartbreaking at points, and it's not, I don't know how to explain this without explaining all of Greek mythology to you, so I won't. But it's so good, and I highly recommend it if you remotely like Greek mythology. And then we've got our last 6 books, which are in my YA section. So first up, we've got Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This is following our main character, Elizabeth, who's grown up in one of the like great libraries of the country. And the libraries basically exist to protect grimoires, which are like magic books. And she's been raised to become a librarian and like protect these books. Then this incident happens, and she is blamed for it, and she's sent to stand trial for it, where she ends up having to team up with this sorcerer named Nathaniel Thorne to try and figure out what happened, and it's this very like reluctant alliance between the two of them. Through it, Elizabeth kind of has to like learn that everything she's been taught is not necessarily correct, and she's kind of like learning to like rethink the way she sees the world, and she and Nathaniel have this kind of like enemies to lovers thing, and it's just so fun. It's a really good standalone fantasy. There is a companion novella, but like it's standalone fantasy. It's such a good time. It's such a fun like book-based world, and it's so good. I really enjoyed it. And then next up is The Ballad of Never After, which is the second book in the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy. I also read the third book in this trilogy this year, but it doesn't make this list. The Ballad of Never After makes this list. It is top tier, enemies to lovers. It is such a good time. Like, A Curse for True Love is good, About It Ever After is absolutely amazing. Where I love our two main characters, Evangeline and Jax, so much. There's not much I can say about this book without spoiling the first book. But it's such a good time. I love this trilogy. It's so much about stories and fairy tales and love, and it's so whimsical and just such a good time. Like, Stephanie Garber is so good at just whimsical and fun YA fantasy. And the next up is Unseelie by Ivelisse Hausman, and I received an e-arc of this back when it came out. And it's a fantasy story about a changeling whose mother traveled into fairy and stole her human child back and raised her as a twin alongside the fairy changeling. It's playing on the whole changelings were probably just autistic children thing in the autistic community. But it's the first fantasy book I've ever read with an autistic protagonist. It was so good. I loved her so much. It's basically they get caught up in a heist they don't really want to be part of, and they're forced to be allies with these two other people that they don't really want to be working with, but they have to by circumstance, and it's so fun. I love it so much. I love our main character Celie's character arc so much, and it's just such a good time. And I'm very sad the second book isn't coming out till 2025, but it's gonna be okay. And then next up is The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. This is the third book in the Winter Night trilogy, and this is such a good trilogy where this is another thing I talk about on this channel all the time, but it's historical fantasy. This also could have been under historical fantasy, but I'm putting it under YA. Although I don't actually know if it's YA. I'm keeping it under YA, but this could have easily been under adult historical fantasy. I'm keeping it under YA just because I think the series is stocked under YA at my local bookstore. But I'm pretty sure it's actually adult fantasy. It's fine. Anyway, the real point is, imagine I talked about this book back during historical fantasy. This is the third book in the Winter Night trilogy. This series is basically set in Russia, and it's about kind of the conflict between Christianity and more pagan traditional beliefs, and it's this world of folklore creatures and demons and spirits, and it's just so lovely and it's beautifully written. The Winter of the Witch is such a wonderful conclusion to the story and to Vasilissa's character arc, and it's just such a good time. This is an absolutely perfect fantasy trilogy. It is amazing. And then next up, we've got Chain of Thorns by Cassandra Clare, which is the third Last Hours book. And this is such a good conclusion. I think Chain of Iron was still the best book in the Last Hours trilogy, but Chain of Thorns was so good. I love all our main characters so much. Anything Cassandra Clare writes, I will eagerly read. It's always a good time. The Shadowhunters books, aside from the original Mortal Instruments series, hold my entire heart. I love this world, I love these characters, I love Cassandra Clare's writing. It's all so good. Chain of Thorns is an absolutely perfect conclusion to that trilogy, and I really can't say that much more about it without explaining a lot of things that happened before that, so that's all I will say. And then last up is The Midnight Girls, which is another book I talk about on this channel all the time. And this is enemies to lovers. It's set in a world based on historical Poland. It's complicated. I was under the impression it was set in Poland, but some of the reviews say it was just inspired by Poland, so I don't know. But it's a good time. It's about these three girls who are, it's really about two of the girls, but it's there's these three girls, and they're each the protege of a witch, and these three witches have to eat the hearts of princes in order to maintain their powers, basically. And so they send their proteges out to steal those hearts for them. Basically, the three are all sent to steal the same prince's heart during Carnival, which is a big winter festival. Two of them have always been competing with each other for their entire lives, and there's this very intense rivalry between them. When the three of them unknowingly share a carriage to town in order to do this, then our two main characters kind of end up falling, developing feelings for each other, and it's super cute. And so this book it's standalone, and it's following our two main characters as they're kind of fighting their feelings for each other and realizing they are allowed to make their own choices, and they don't have to continue to do these things just because that's what they're raised to do, and that's what the witches want them to do, and making their own choices and choosing their own lives. And it's so good. It's such good standalone fantasy. It's very wintry. I love them so much. And yeah, those are my 20 favorite fantasy books I read in 2023. I loved all these so much. They were all 5-star reads. Except the Midnight Girls I gave 4.5 stars, so I put it on this list over some other 5-star fantasy reads just because I loved it more than I loved them. Even though it wasn't quite maybe not technically as good as them. But Yeah, these are all such a good time. I love them all, and honestly, I highly recommend any of the books on this list. They're all so good. And yeah, thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this video. I really appreciate it. Please like, comment, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me. You can find me on my blog, Goodreads, Instagram, and Storygraph at the links in my channel. And this is the last day of Bookmas, so I will see you for regularly scheduled programming from now on. And yeah, thanks so much for sticking around at the end, and I will see you later.